Welcome, everyone. I am Heidi Adams. I am a broadcast journalist with The Voice of America in VOA's Africa News Division. And I'd like to thank you so much for being here to discuss a set of issues that is vital for our world's future and is a central part of the multifaceted engagement between US and African partners, and that is of supporting conservation, climate adaptation, and the just energy transition. We are fortunate to have such a distinguished group of participants in this session, including our heads of state from African countries, leading the way on innovative solutions to the climate and biodiversity crises, multiple members of the US Cabinet, members of Congress, and luminaries from the private, NGO, and philanthropic sectors in both US and Africa, whose collaboration is so important in our collective efforts. I'm so enthused to moderate this discussion and hear from the diversity of speakers on how the United States and African nations can catalyze further action and collaboration on these issues in service of building our green future together, which is, of course, our theme for the session today. Now, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Our session today will have an introduction, then 3 thematic discussions on conservation, climate adaptation, and the just energy transition. We will then have time for short interventions on cross-cutting themes from a few of our audience members prior to closing remarks. And for those of you at our inner table, there is a push-to-talk microphone in front of each of you. And you each have headsets for simultaneous interpretation in Arabic, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. For others making interventions, we will have runners bring handheld microphones to you, of course. We have such an incredible and diverse group gathered here today that in order to afford equitable participation to all, I ask that you please ensure to keep to your allotted speaking time. Now, I'm a very, very nice person, and I'd like to stay that way, so I ask, please don't make me be a stickler for timekeeping, because I would have to enforce time limits. But nevertheless, I look forward to a robust and enriching discussion today, which our organizers hope to be a sort of jumping off point for even more fruitful engagement and collaboration going forward. And with that, to open our discussion, I would like to turn now to the US Secretary of State, Mr. Antony Blinken.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And a big thank you, Heidi, to you for keeping us moving, and I will try to stay on your good side. But it's an honor to be joined at this table by so many leaders, so many colleagues, among others, President Tshisekedi. It's very good to be with you, President Ramkalawan, President Hichilema, President Buhari, President Obiang, President Bongo Ondimba. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your partnership to help preserve our planet. We're also joined today by members of Congress, members of the Biden cabinet. I think Congressman Meeks is about to join us if he's not already here. We have representatives from multilateral organizations, philanthropies, private sector leaders, activists, academics, youth leaders. To each and every one of you, welcome. The diversity of this group is heartening. A statement not merely of how we're all affected by the climate crisis, but how committed we all are to working together to address it. Last month, many of us were in Egypt for COP27. An African COP was a recognition that as the urgency of the climate crisis grows, our focus must increasingly be on Africa. As we know, 17 of the world's 20 most climate vulnerable countries are on the African continent. 4 straight years of drought in the Horn of Africa have left more than 18 million people facing severe hunger. Communities across the continent are feeling the impact of a changing climate. Severe storms have battered southern Africa. Surging temperatures kindle wildfires in northern Africa. Rising seas threaten lives and livelihoods on island nations, while extreme weather events in Central Africa worsen already dire food crises and fuel tensions that feed and fuel violent conflict. We know that African nations have contributed relatively little to this crisis, but are disproportionately harmed by it. It's both unfair and unrealistic to ask them to turn their backs on economic development and opportunity in the name of a clean energy transition, to ask them, in effect, to forego what many of us have done in the past in developing our countries and our economies. And so we believe that the best way, indeed the just way, to address the climate crisis in Africa is to work together. Earlier this year in South Africa, I had an opportunity to set out President Biden's new strategy for sub-Saharan Africa. It's based on a simple idea. We can't achieve any of our shared priorities, tackle any of our biggest challenges, unless we do it together as equal partners. That's true of every major issue we face today, and it's particularly true of climate change. So, here's how we're addressing this crisis together. First, we are partnering to conserve ecosystems. Africa is home to some of the world's most precious ecosystems, which are critical for combating climate change. This summer, I visited the Democratic Republic of Congo, where forests absorb more carbon than is emitted by the entire continent of Africa. The Congo Basin is also a place of tremendous biodiversity, a life force for agriculture across the region. To support the sustainable management of the Congo Basin rainforest, we've invested over $600 million in the Central Africa Regional Program for the Environment, which brings together the U.S. government and African and U.S. NGOs. And we're building new coalitions between African governments, the private sector, civil society, to protect other vital ecosystems across the continent. Oceans are also a key part of this fight. That's why we've launched the Ocean Conservation Pledge to encourage countries to commit to protect at least 30% of their ocean waters by the year 2030. Second, we're partnering to make commitments and communities more resilient in the face of climate change. The President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience is working with national governments to help more than 500 million people in developing countries manage the impacts of climate change. This and other initiatives to support climate-resilient agriculture are increasingly critical as Russia's war of aggression compounds the impact on food security. At COP, the President also announced a doubling of our pledge contributions to the Adaptation Fund, which has already deployed nearly $1 billion to help over 36 million people in the most vulnerable communities around the world. And we committed to begin discussions on loss and damage funding arrangements to support low and middle income countries. Third, we're partnering to advance a just transition to a clean energy economy that both saves our planet and fosters inclusive economic opportunity. Africa will be at the center of the clean energy transition. Its renewable energy potential is second to none. It's home to roughly a third of all critical minerals essential to the technology that will power the clean energy economy, like batteries for renewable energy storage and wind turbines. But with nearly half of sub-Saharan Africa's population lacking reliable access to electricity, and the population set to grow to more than 2 billion people by 2050, how that transition is made will be decisive in shaping our future climate. The United States will work closely with African countries as they determine how best to meet their specific energy needs, understanding that for many, the clean energy transition will be a transition to consistent, reliable energy in the first place. We'll do so through programs like Power Africa, which has mobilized the public and private sectors to deliver cleaner, more reliable electricity to over 165 million people in sub-Saharan Africa who previously didn't have access. We're proud to announce a new investment of $290 million in that program. Too often, those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of these changes have been denied a seat at the decision-making table. We're committed to changing that, including through the new Accelerating Women's Empowerment in Energy project, which is making sure that women have a say in how their countries move forward on clean energy. All of these efforts recognize that combating the climate crisis, like so many other challenges we face, was actually championed by Africans in the first place. Indeed, in Africa, we see not only the stakes of this crisis, but also the solutions. Gabon has led the way in conserving its forest resources, which now absorb 140 million tons of CO2 every year. That's the equivalent of taking 30 million cars off the road. The Seychelles has pioneered the world's first sovereign blue bond to marshal public and private investment for sustainable marine and fisheries projects. It's on the way to conserving 30% of its ocean waters, that's an area the size of Zimbabwe, by 2030. Zambia is harnessing the power of its wetlands and forests to mitigate climate impacts, benefiting tens of thousands of people vulnerable to both floods and to droughts. Nigeria has set bold targets and robust regulations for methane reductions, the first country in Africa to do so, which could reduce air pollutants by a third and avert tens of thousands of deaths. Equatorial Guinea just raised its commitment to cut emissions by 35% by 2030. And the DRC has hosted the pre-COP27 meetings in Kinshasa. It's teaming up with the United States on a broad scope of these issues through our Sustainable Development Solutions Working Group. Today, and throughout this summit over the course of this week, I look forward to hearing from this group on how we can most effectively deepen our partnership to the benefit of all of our people, and indeed to the benefit of people around the world. And I look forward to continuing this conversation in the months and also the years to come. This is an enduring project for all of us, but I think we also all feel the fierce urgency of now. And that determination is reflected in so much of the work that is being done and is being represented in this room. With that, it is a pleasure and an honor to turn the floor over to President Sikasheti to offer some remarks. Mr. President, the floor is now yours.
Voilà. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, les chefs d'État et de gouvernement.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, heads of government, heads of delegation, distinguished guests, I want to salute the initiative of President Biden to organize this USA-Africa summit, which gives us today the opportunity to exchange on one of the major questions that we have to deal with, which is the climate change, as well as the energy transition that is required. Since we are gathered here to speak about fighting against climate change, if you will allow me, I would like to speak first with regret to let you know about the crisis that my country has lived through the past few hours, through the floods and the diluvian rains because of the climate crisis that have caused hundreds of deaths as well as enormous material damages that could have been avoided if the commitments of the polluting countries would have been kept for the past few years. So it is imperious, it is necessary to act now. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is happy with the American leadership, which is materialized by the Inflation Reduction Act that was adopted the 16th of August past to reduce by 40% the carbon emission, the American carbon emission by 2030. Indeed, the Inflation Reduction Act, even though it is a local application, is a real source of inspiration for African countries because it shows that fighting climate change does not mean that you have to abandon in economic growth. It is actually the engine. It is possible to manage climate change with innovative policies that are conformed, that comply to sustainable development objective, the SDGs. And this is why, because with strategic minings, we have a win-win partnership with the United States to attain the objective set by the Inflation Reduction. And so the energy transition will have an impact on the world level. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, heads of state and government, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, heads of delegation and guests, the Democratic Republic of the Congo has the most important biodiversity of the world and is part of the world fight. So in terms of the environment, my country has major challenges in terms of security, where now more than 30 years we have had issues in the east of the countries. Armed groups as well as terrorists threaten the security of the eastern part, in particular the M23, supported by Rwanda, and they also massacre populations and exploit illegally the strategic ores, do deforestation, massive deforestation, and inside protected areas, such as Maiko Park in the Congo Basin. The Depulu reserves, the Kauzibiga and the Kivu South, as well as the Virunda Park in the north of Kivu. So that is to say that the issue of security in the east of my country is inseparable with protection of its biodiversity. It is thus urgent and necessary to put an end to this, to put an end to the activities of armed groups as well. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, heads of state and government, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, heads of delegations, dear guests, I would like to be the speaker on behalf of the African continent, which is the most impacted by climate change, without being responsible for it and without having the means to confront it. I am happy of the financial support of the American government, and I hope more commitment. I am convinced that an innovative collaboration that would be a win-win, that will be using the mechanism set forth by the Paris COP, reaffirmed by Glasgow, and also the COP27, will allow industrialized countries that have been historically responsible for the climate change to support the African continent, not only in its adaptation to climate change, but also to pursue its development. I want to salute the creation of the Klima group, which is the proof of the reinforced cooperation between our two countries. My wish is that for this group, which would set up a program that would be ambitious and support the energy transition, support parks and forests, and also provide support for evaluating our natural resources and the improvement of their management, which is why we actually are part of the observation group. Then we need to take here just a decision that will contribute to save our planet and that will strengthen the relationship between our two countries, as well as the relationship between the United States and Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Tshisekedi and Secretary Blinken, for those important remarks to open our session. I now have the privilege to turn the microphone over to Chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, U.S. Representative Gregory Meeks.
Thank you and good afternoon. Your Excellencies, heads of government, heads of delegations. Let me first start out by thanking President Biden and his administration, led by Secretary of State Blinken and his team, for highlighting this important issue during the summit and for inviting me to be here today. Thank you and welcome to our distinguished panelists and guests. There's a lot of ground to cover during this session, so I'm going to keep my remarks brief. Last month, I had the opportunity to travel to Egypt for COP27 and was pleased that with the message of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which was the most significant climate legislation in the United States history, the United States was able to come to the summit with real results in hand. This important legislation will help us meet our climate goals by cutting greenhouse gases in half by 2030, as indicated by Secretary Blinken, and reach net zero by 2050. It showed that the United States was not only advocating for climate action, it was doing it. And it showed the connection with the executive branch of government and the legislative branch of government, that we were working collectively hand in hand and using the power of our example to mobilize other countries to follow suit. So when I became chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I seized the opportunity to increase the committee's focus on climate change, its effects on vulnerable populations, and ways we can work together to find solutions. I've made these issues central to our foreign policy agenda by moving Africa, number one, on the front burner of the committee, not on the back burner, by holding hearings, helping move important legislative measures, and incorporating ecology and conservation in our committee travel. In fact, many of us traveled to several countries around the continent and made sure that we saw some of the conservation issues that was presenting themselves and how we could work collectively together to resolve these. And I continue to elevate these issues because it's the right thing to do for our future and because it's impossible to ignore the evidence all around us, especially on the continent of Africa. Climate change is creating a new class of refugees. Animals unique to the continent are becoming endangered, due in part to loss of habitat. And it is a region facing a global green energy transition with less resources than wealthier economies. The United States, of course, is one of those wealthier economies. It is an economy that was built by industrialization, using the very fossil fuels that have contributed to the climate crisis that the world faces today. So we in the United States have a duty and an obligation to help fix this. And one way is through increasing investments that support resiliency and capacity of indigenous communities. Last year in Glasgow, the international community, in recognition of the role indigenous communities play in protecting our environment, pledged $1.7 billion to support these communities. These are the same communities that bear the outsized cost of climate change in comparison to what they have contributed to it. That is why at COP27, I expressed my strong support for the historic Loss and Damage Climate Fund. The establishment of this fund sends an important signal that we acknowledge and take responsibility for the harms that brought us where we are today. Another important step we are taking is to ensure that a small group of wealthy countries responsible for most global emissions are transitioning from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. We're working to make sure they and we do this while doing more to help low-income countries avoid long-term fossil addiction, including through increased financing and ensuring that there is private investment that will benefit the people of Africa, especially the youth, creating jobs and opportunity in renewable energy, which is where we are headed in the future. So taking these steps will help the United States strengthen its climate diplomacy in Africa and build trust and credibility with our partners around the world. We cannot fight back against climate change unless we lead a global coalition through the strength of our example. And that
E é isto que pretendemos fazer no Congresso. Eu ouso dizer que nós podemos fazer isto de forma bipartidária para que o Congresso e o Executivo trabalhem juntos para salvar este lugar que nós chamamos de planeta Terra. Muito obrigado, senhor secretário, pelo convite e agradeço aos chefes de Estado, suas excelências aqui presentes, para tratarmos juntos desta questão que ameaça o nosso globo, ou seja, o clima. Muito obrigada, representante Mix. Algumas de nossas autoridades precisam sair porque tem vários compromissos nesta cimeira. Nós